Hello again, everybody. This is the last video in the Content Area 3, Early Europe and Colonial Americas. We're going to be talking about Mannerism, Baroque art, New Spain, and I put in other, I felt like there were two that didn't really fit, but I think they're important to talk about because they're a part of the content area. All right, so let's start out with Mannerism. So this is the late Renaissance, 16th century. We see this break from this high Renaissance style where things are very organized, very clear, super naturalistic. And we start to see some shifts, and this Pontormo work is a perfect example of it. So it's a depiction of the entombment of Christ. However, we don't see a cross anywhere. We don't see a tomb. It's not very clear what's going on in the space. The colors are really kind of jarring, all this blue and this pink. They're very, very opposite. We see a lot of twisting and unstable composition. So you see these figures that are really contorted. His torso is actually like not realistic the way that it's positioned. Same thing with this guy down here. And there's no like regularity in the space. So the center point, really there's nothing going on. So instead there's things like off to the side. They're exaggerating figures and positioning, and things are a little bit more chaotic. So this is something, they're being more playful now. Mannerism really means just a manner of creating or a style. So it's kind of just doing something a little bit different versus in the Renaissance, they're really trying for that naturalism, the classical style. All right, so if we look at Mannerism and then Baroque, Il Gesù is a great example. This church on the outside is more Manneristic, and then by the time they got to decorating the inside, Baroque became more in favor, that styling. So let's start with the outside and Mannerism in terms of architecture. So when we look at this piece, you see a lot of classical elements that you probably recognize. We see pediments over doors. We see things that are triangular and curved. We see these scroll pieces. We see some engaged columns, but they're all put in very different ways. So we see curves and triangles together. We see different heights. We see columns that are positioned at different places, so there's no regularity of one. Now there's two, nothing, two. We see, as I said, more triangular, geometric, and then we see more curved elements. Here we even see them together. So it's taking a lot of the classical elements, but putting them together in unorthodox ways. When we get to the interior, we have this fresco on the ceiling, and then you can see the ornamentation here. So very, very Baroque, very awe-provoking, very theatrical. We see a lot of gold and ornamentation just everywhere. When we look at the fresco on the ceiling, we see painting, but we also see some stucco. It's kind of hard to show in this picture, but they actually used stucco, kind of like a plaster, to make some of the figures 3D on the surface. So they'd start with painting a figure and then have elements that would kind of come out at you just to increase the awe-provoking nature, so it really feels like people are falling from the sky. And this is just this heavenly glow, so it makes it feel like everybody's kind of floating into this heavenly space. Very, very impressive in the amount of detail, overwhelming. Just a lot of detail when it comes to Baroque. All right, moving on. For Baroque art and architecture, we're talking about the 17th and early 18th century. Here we're going to talk about the Ecstasy of St. Teresa by Bernini, and then San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane by Borromini over here. So if we start with just in general some characteristics of Baroque, we see lots of dynamism and movement. We see a lot of emotion and passion, really intense emotion. You're supposed to feel something really intense when you look at it. High tension, single light sources, especially when it comes to painting, and then diagonal composition. So we take away that orderly pyramidal composition of the Renaissance, and now it's things are a little more dynamic. So remember the Ecstasy of St. Teresa. He creates this almost stage. He worked in the theater, Bernini did, before becoming an architect. And so you see this theatrical element. We see this raised platform. There's also off to the side these almost boxes where there are other sculptures looking at the main sculpture. We also have this light from above and all of this cloud element all above the important sculpture that's in the center. The gold rays add to the drama of it. And here we have this intense spiritual experience. We see the folds in the fabric are so soft and so much movement. And then we have the rocks that the figures on have a very different feel. So there's lots and lots of drama in the positioning. We have those diagonals. When you look at this, you definitely feel the emotion and the experience that St. Teresa is experiencing. When we move over and look at San Carlo, this is a church too. And if we look at the ground plan, very, very different than other churches we've seen. Remember, we were looking at cruciform churches before. Even when we look at Il Gesù, I don't have that picture of it, but you can see it's very centralized, very cruciform in style. And now all of a sudden, they're kind of throwing that all out and doing something completely different with the space. Some of the things that make this highly Baroque, because we don't have a lot of that gold. We have all of these undulating shapes, so things that are curvy. We have columns on the interior, spaces that kind of go in and out and in and out. Look at how complex this dome is, very geometric, but very different than any other dome that we've seen before. And the outside and the inside are supposed to kind of mimic and work with each other. So we see a lot of these same kind of curvy, swaying lines on the interior and on the exterior. We also have multiple facades. So here's one facade, one entry point. We have this corner sculpture, and then there's another one over here. Very different styling as well. So being very playful and adding in lots and lots of dynamism and movement is also very common in the architecture at this time. Very irregular. All right, another place that we can see Baroque architecture is the Palace of Versailles. So this would be French Baroque, but it's the same thing as far as the epitome of decadence. A lot of power is shown in the amount of detail and ambition in this project. We have the outside facade, we have the whole floor plan, we have the hall of mirrors, and then we have this courtyard where you see a lot of details. So there's a lot to look at, but some of the main things that you see that are really Baroque, we have all of the gold and ornamentation on this interior space, but then even in the courtyards, we have geometric patterns, we have curved patterns, lots of different details, and then as it goes further and further away from the main building, the landscape becomes more and more simple, so it's a way to kind of connect it to that outer area. Okay, moving on, let's look at Baroque painting. So I kind of split these up because of region, but there are a lot of similarities between them. So we have the Spanish Baroque, Las Meninas, we have the Flanders Baroque, we have Rubens' Portrait of Mary de' Medici, and then we have Caravaggio's Calling of St. Matthew. This isn't the actual shape of the painting. Remember, it's a square. This just cut it off for styling in the PowerPoint. All right, so let's start with Las Meninas up in the top. So some of the things when we talk about Baroque painting that you might notice. The big one is tenebrism, and Caravaggio is really famous for kind of getting tenebrism started, but we definitely see it in Velázquez's piece. So we see this really strong light source near the front, and then there's a lot of darkness behind. It kind of focuses the eye and adds drama to the space. Remember that Velázquez becomes a court painter for King Philip IV in Spain, so he's working solely for King Philip. And we see naturalism in the figures, so this is kind of a family portrait. We see figures that were realistic to those that would actually be in the palace, and so he's actually working with live models. There's also visual tricks in it, right? We see this big canvas, we see the painter, so Velázquez is painting himself. We also see this might be a mirror or might be a portrait showing us the king and queen that we can't see. So there's a lot of stuff to look at and a lot of drama in the space because we don't completely understand what is going on. When we move on and talk about the Portrait of Mary de' Medici by Rubens, you can see that the style is a little bit different. This is very soft, very flowy, but still very dramatic. We have diagonals in the composition, so you might be drawn here to begin with, and then you might be drawn down here to these cupids, you might be drawn to the above elements, so it kind of is pulling your eye through the whole piece. You can see by This depiction here, he's swooning over this image of Mary de Medici. So there's a lot of emotion and passion in the stance even of him, all based on this picture that he's being shown of her. We also see contorted figures, so lots of contortion in the angels that are flying around. Remember, this is one of 21 commissions that Rubens did for Marie de Medici. She wanted all of these paintings showing how great and fantastic she was. She also had him use a lot of mythology to show how she had this bigger right to rule than just herself. So there's a lot of angels and symbolism in there to show how great and grand she was, which, remember, the Baroque style was very popular with the upper class. And so this is a way to kind of highlight their decadence by using this style in the painting. All right, lastly, let's talk about the last one here. We have Calling of St. Matthew. Tenebrism, great example here. We have a strong light source coming in. Caravaggio used everyday people and settings to tell religious stories. So this is just a depiction of a pub, regular people. They even believe that he would take people from the street, just regular people, and ask them to model so that he could create the realism and make people connected to the religious story. There's a lot of drama in the positioning. And once again, we have these diagonals. The fingers are kind of creating this this way that your eye moves through the space to kind of figure out the main elements of the story as well. So all three different styles when we look at the painting style, but there are elements that all make them Baroque. Highly dramatic, figures that are very realistic or twisted, lots of emotion in the pieces as well, and that tenebrism, that darkness. All right, we're going to switch gears here and move on to New Spain. All right, New Spain. We start with the Codex of Mendoza, which we actually looked at as a part of the indigenous unit, but this is actually a part of the content area 3, so we're going to cover it here for the review. So what makes this piece an interesting one, and a lot of the New Spain works, is that we're talking about the New World, but we're talking about European influences because we have the Spanish that are coming in to get gold and to take over the lands of a lot of the indigenous people. So we see influences from them, but we also see indigenous references and elements that are brought into the artwork. So this piece was actually commissioned by native scribes in the Mexican region, and it was commissioned by probably the viceroy, commissioned as a one page in an illuminated manuscript that was probably meant for King Charles back in Spain. So the idea was that they wanted a complete history, 200-year history of the Aztecs so that they could send it back to the king in Spain. It never made it there, but that was the intention. And the summary starts with the earliest memories of the Aztecs all the way up to when the Spanish come and overtake them. So this is, remember, just this early depiction. There are references to the creation of the Aztec capital, references to some of their daily life activities, plants that are known, so you can kind of go back and look at your own imagery of it. But this is one page in that manuscript. All right, moving on. We look at the angel with arquebus. Think about, at this time in Europe, the church is facing some difficulties from lots of different sides, and so starting to think of the church as an army and angels as soldiers. So that's where this concept came from in Europe. It was brought to New Spain in the Spanish colony. And so we see an angel with a gun, very popular, but there are things that make it very different than what we were seeing in Europe. We do have a Mannerist kind of style of a body, very, very strange shape of the body. Things are kind of out of proportion and a little bit experimental, so that Mannerist style does make it to New Spain. But the dress combines European elements and indigenous elements. So we kind of have these plume areas, the buckled shoes. These are all European elements of the dress, but what makes it more indigenous is all of this really, really detailed patterning this is something that would have shown a high status in this Aztec world. So a lot of their cloaks or dress would have really, really detailed ornamental patterns. So it's kind of combining those two elements together. When we look to the right, we're seeing Spaniard and Indian produce a mestizo. A mestizo was the word that they used for a child, an offspring of a European and an indigenous person. So these were considered cast paintings. We believe they were mostly fictitious, just to show the combination of the two together and what the child might look like. We also see the dress showing who the European is, showing who the indigenous person is, and we don't exactly know who these were meant for. Probably Europeans who were just really fascinated by the different types of people in the New World. They were also possibly, people that were of lighter skin that looked more European were considered higher class or above those who had darker skin and more of the indigenous characteristics. So a lot of these cast paintings would actually show multiple different combinations of different races kind of coming together. So once again, we're seeing these two different styles converge in this kind of strange way. All right, two other ones. We're going to look at the Virgin of Guadalupe and then the portrait of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. This piece is actually in our next content area. So it's in later Europe and the Americas. I put it in here because it's the only other one that has to do with New Spain in this way, and it's the first one in that content area. So I just thought it would be nice to kind of put them together here. All right, let's start with the Virgin of Guadalupe. In addition to it being a painting, we're seeing this enconchado style where they used shells as inlay. This is a traditional style that we see in the Mexican arts. This love for the Virgin Mary, remember there's this cult of the Virgin Mary back in Europe that's really forming, it makes it to New Spain. And all of a sudden, in addition to this cult of the Virgin Mary, they create this more indigenous style of Mary. So it becomes the Virgin of Guadalupe, becomes very, very, very famous and very beloved in this region. She is shown with darker skin, so she doesn't have that pale complexion of the Virgin Mary, and it's basically this indigenous version of her. We see lots of other imagery around showing details of her life, but the main thing is this pious positioning, the hands clasped in prayer. She still has a cloak, but it's combining that virginal image with some of the styling that's considered more indigenous. That was a tough one. All right, moving on over here to the portrait of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. This one's done a little bit later. It was a portrait of her that was done posthumously. So she was a nun and was also considered one of the first feminists in the New World. So she was a writer and an intellectual. When mostly men were featured in these roles, she's actually in the positioning that many men were shown in a library, shown at a desk, showing their wisdom, and she was painted in this position as well. There's a lot of symbolism in the images that we see here, so you can go back and kind of look at some of those details and what they show. But she wrote and protected a lot of people in her world and was an important character, an important feminist at the time in this New Spain. All right. Moving on, we're going to look at the screen with the Siege of Belgrade and the hunting scene. So on one side, we have this incredible battle scene, and on the other one, we have a hunting scene, something that was more just for the ladies. So this side was dedicated more for the wife of the viceroy, something that was a little bit lighter, and then the battle scene would have been for the viceroy himself. So remember that the leader of New Spain was the viceroy. And so this would be something that he would have in his home in New Spain. We have the two different sides to kind of delineate spaces, and this was very, very influenced by the idea of Japanese screens, and then also Japanese lacquered boxes. So a lot of the details we see in here, we also have shell inlay that makes it more Mexican. And then it looks a lot like a Medici tapestry that they would have back in Europe. Lots of details, very similar to what you'd see in France. We have these floral details, all these edging. So there's a lot of influence from Japan, also from this region in Mexico, and then also from Europe together. So all of those things converging in this one art object. It shows that there's a lot of trade at the time and a lot of travel between those places as well at the time. All right, lastly, Allegory of Law and Grace, and then the Tete and Tete from the Marriage a la Mode. So the Allegory of Law and Grace, this was a print. This was something that could have been given out to lots of different people who might have been illiterate, and it shows the differences between Catholicism and Protestantism. It's trying to promote Protestantism. So with Catholicism, you have to have good deeds to get into human, but Protestantism, they're talking more about just having the belief and following the stories of the Bible. So it's a piece of propaganda and trying to convert people. So they made these prints that could be easily given out. Lots of symbolism in the story here, so I would go back and check your notes if you need to. And then the Tete a Tete. This is from an English series. This is a painting, but then there were lots of prints that were made and distributed of it. It shows this aristocratic class in this satirical way. So this specific one from the Marriage a la Mode series is showing a man coming back late, probably from the bars. I believe he has some like women's underwear stuffed in his pocket. The woman, it looks like she might have been out drinking. Their house is kind of destroyed. So it's a way for the middle class to kind of laugh at this Baroque aristocratic class that's developing too. So it's showing kind of a difference between those two classes, and the prints make it accessible for all of those middle class people. All right, so that ends our unit. I hope you guys have a good time thinking about these pieces and study up well.